know about the USA? Do you know about the government? Can you tell me about the Constitution? Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free. The USA was just starting out, a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. Alright, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In 2 words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Ah, supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, you know, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation: Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course World History fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must, and the Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through treaties signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs, but because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, a fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, I mean, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something.
Okay, here we are to discuss the Constitution, Chapter 5. All right, when we're looking at this slide, we can see that the Articles of Confederation lasted from 1776 to 1787. They were kind of like our first Constitution. The Articles of Confederation established a very weak central government. Under these articles, each state had to send a delegation to a capital city. This delegation was known as the Confederation Congress. There were not separate branches at this time. This group could declare war, raise armies, and sign treaties. The Congress was not able to impose taxes or regulate trade, which were two major issues. And then there's the Western policies. And you can see the picture down there to the right as I read this. Since the Congress could not tax or regulate trade, the only way the Confederate Congress could raise money to pay its debt was to sell the land it controlled west of the Appalachian Mountains. Congress would eventually pass the Northwest Ordinance, which created more land north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. This land could eventually be divided into 3 to 5 states. This ordinance was considered a success of the Articles of Confederation. It provided for the survey of land in the Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, and set up clear and orderly process by which new states were admitted into the Union on an equal basis. For example, to become a state from being a territory, you must have a population of at least 60,000 people. Ohio is the first state admitted. It's the 14th state in the Union. Dividing up the land of a state was, you see the 36 square miles over there? It equaled a township. For example, in Las Vegas, we have Winchester, Spring Valley, Centennial Hills. Those are different townships. Each township, one of the square miles, the 16th, was issued for public schools, which is where schools are built by the public so that public education could be spread around the United States. Now, you can see the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. A weak national government, Congress could not tax or regulate commerce, which is money among states, no common currency, which is dollar bills. You didn't have money that matched. You'd have a dollar bill for one state and a dollar bill for another state and a dollar bill for another state. And it's like when you would travel around Europe and you'd have, a franc for France and a Deutschmark for Germany and then a pound for England, and you'd have to exchange your money. Well, even Europe now has gone to the common euro, and we went to the dollar back then to have a common sense of money throughout all of our states. So the success in trade. Following the Revolutionary War, Britain imposed harsh trade restrictions on the United States when it came to trade with other British colonies. Now remember, Britain had the largest empire, so that was kind of important that we could trade with them, as well as the mainland. To overcome these problems, representatives from the Congress negotiated several trade treaties with other countries, including Holland, Prussia, and Sweden. Prussia does not exist anymore. The United States also had a commercial treaty in place with France. By 1790, the United States trading was much greater than when they were the American colonies. The Congress falters. Problems with trade. Due to several states having different tax regulations, the British were able to sell their goods in the new nation. To take advantage of the system, the British would have their goods sent to the states with the lower taxes or fewest restrictions. The Congress was unable to regulate trade commerce, so the states started setting up custom ports on their borders to prevent the British from exploiting the different trade laws. States would also levy taxes on one another to raise revenue. With all of this happening, each state was starting to act like an independent country, which threatened the unity of the new nation. Okay, so again, we're still before the Constitution. We're at the Articles of Confederation. You can look at the pictures to the right. Problems with diplomacy. Once the war ended and the Treaty of Paris was signed, the Americans faced several challenges. In each instance, America did not honor their agreement with the treaty. When America did not hold up their expectations, the British became outraged and refused to follow some of the guidelines presented in the treaty. With Congress not having the power to tax or regulate trade, many of these problems became huge obstacles for the new nation. With the economic crisis, due to the high cost of fighting the Revolutionary War, the United States went into a severe recession. Farmers were among the first who were most affected. To help pay debt, each state could raise taxes. Farmers encouraged the state to print more money to offset the debt. I think we know that that does not, in the current economic environment that we're in, that does not work. However, with that idea came problems of inflation. In Rhode Island, among many other states, money had virtually no value. Shays' Rebellion, named for Daniel Shay, who is a veteran of the American Revolution. And you can see the picture down to the right. A full-scale rebellion took place in Massachusetts. The rebellion started when the government of Massachusetts decided to raise taxes and not print more money. These taxes fell very heavily on the farmers of Massachusetts, particularly poor farmers. These farmers struggled with the debt issues, forcing many of them to lose their farms. Angry with the legislature's decision, the farmers revolted and closed down several county courthouses to prevent farm foreclosures. Daniel Shay would emerge as one of the rebellion's leaders. This rebellion is considered by some the first civil war in America, but also showed our government how weak the Articles of Confederation were. So there was a call for change. With Shays' Rebellion, really pushed a lot of Americans to realize how weak the Articles of Confederation were. People in the country wanted a stronger central government. They wanted a government that could levy taxes, which means collect taxes and regulate trade. With all of these problems that were taking place at the time, especially Shays' Rebellion, only added fuel to the argument. So the summary of this, the Articles of Confederation are too weak because the states had all of the power.
Is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and Senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a 2-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. New Jersey. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us 2 houses. A House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, population and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though, of course, they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious Three-Fifths Compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons, the word slave was never used, would be the basis for the calculation. So, yeah, that's still in the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a fugitive slave clause requiring any escaped slave to be returned to their master. And this meant that a slave couldn't escape slavery by moving to a state where slavery was outlawed, which meant that on some level, some states couldn't enforce their own laws. Spoiler alert, this becomes problematic. But except for the tyranny of slavery, the framers really hated tyranny. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced 2 principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise. You can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state governments. As an American, I am a citizen both of the United States and of the state of Indiana. And the national government, the one set up by the Constitution, is supposed to be limited in scope to certain enumerated powers. Most other powers, especially the protection of health, safety, and morals, are left to the states. But the Constitution also seeks to protect against the radicalism that too much democracy can bring. The mostly rich framers worried that the people, many of whom were poor and indebted, might vote in congresspeople or, God forbid, a president in favor of, like, redistribution of property. To hedge against this, senators were elected by the states, usually by state legislatures, and they were supposed to be like leading citizen types. You know, the kind of good Americans who take bribes and have adulterous affairs in airport bathrooms and patronize prostitutes and shoot Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, the other hedge against too much democracy is the aforementioned Electoral College, which many Americans hate because it has the potential to elect a president who did not win the popular vote. But that's kind of the point. The electors were supposed to be prominent, educated men of property who were better able to elect a president than, like, the rabble. But the Constitution of the United States is a really impressive document, especially when you consider its longevity. I mean, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, the nation-state is pretty new on the historical scene, and the United States established by the Constitution is actually one of the oldest ones. But the Constitution would be meaningless if it hadn't been ratified, which it was, but not without a fight that helped clarify America's political ideology. 9 out of the 13 states were required to ratify the Constitution, and special conventions called for the purpose. In order to convince the delegates to vote for it, 3 of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays that together are known as the Federalist Papers. Taken together, they're a powerful and ultimately persuasive argument for why a strong national government is necessary and ultimately not a threat to people's liberty.
Building a new constitution. So this is kind of like the next section. So you can see a new constitution, the Constitutional Convention. The weaknesses of the Confederation Congress allowed many American leaders to believe the United States would not survive without a strong central government. February 21st, 1787, the Articles Congress called a convention of state delegates to Philadelphia to propose a plan for government. People who supported the fight for a stronger national government were called nationalists. New York delegate Alexander Hamilton recommended that Congress itself call for another convention to be held in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Every state except Rhode Island sent delegates to what became known as the Constitutional Convention. In May 1787, delegates took their places in Pennsylvania Courthouse, State House in Philadelphia. 74 delegates were appointed to attend, but only 55 delegates showed up. Rhode Island refused to send delegates. Their main goals were to balance rights and form a stronger national government. The founders, the elite group of delegates that attended the convention in Philadelphia, included some of the most influential men in American history. So what we have here in building the new Constitution are 2 plans of looking at the way we could build a new country, the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan. And so looking at the picture down to the right, You can see the Virginia plan called for scrapping all of the Articles of Confederation. The plan called for a new national government with the power to make laws binding upon other states, which means that their laws were more important than the states, and to raise its own money through taxes. The plan also proposed that the legislature be divided into two houses. The two houses would have representatives voted by citizens from each state. So this is the bicameral or two-house system. The number of representatives from each state would be dependent upon the state's total population. The plan clearly favored the larger states, which would have more votes than the smaller states. And we don't mean large states by geographical size, we mean large states by population size. The New Jersey plan did not abandon the Articles of Confederation. However, the plan did modify them to make central government stronger. Under the New Jersey plan, Congress would have a single house in which the state was equally represented, but would also have the power to raise taxes and regulate trade. So we must come to a bit of a compromise, which sometimes we don't often see in government any longer, but back then we did see this. And so we have on this slide the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and the Great Compromise. And you can see how the Virginia plan was bicameral, two houses. The New Jersey plan was one house. And the compromise within the Great Compromise or Connecticut plan is bicameral, where one house is represented by the population. That's the House of Representatives. And the other house is by population, House of Representatives. And the other is just simply that you get two per state, no matter the size of your state, and that's the Senate. The executive branch, that's the president. Judiciary, that's where we have all the laws being interpreted. And then you have the states and the ratification. As far as building a new constitution, the Connecticut Compromise, again, I mentioned this before, is the Great Compromise. Originally, the Congress was going to back the Virginia plan. Outraged by the decision, the smaller states insisted that they have an equal vote in the matter. Larger states, disgruntled with the opinion, threatened to walk out of the meeting in an attempt to come to a conclusion. The Congress appointed a special committee to resolve the differences between the states. The delegates selected were as close to impartial as there were, which helped the situation. The Great Compromise is also called the Connecticut Compromise because Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut, proposed the idea. In the Great Compromise, ideas from both New Jersey and Virginia plans were used in fairness to all the delegates involved. And here you're looking at another compromise, one that we would probably consider to be outlandish in our ideas of how we count people in the United States. Because we would never typically look at one person being that different from another person that they would not count as a whole person. With the Three-Fifths Compromise, it's another hot topic at the Constitutional Convention, where Benjamin Franklin proposed that one member of the House of Representatives be elected for every 40,000 people. Well, the proposal caused a split between the North and the South because though the Southerners did not want to give rights to the slaves, for some reason, they wanted representation based upon it. I know this doesn't make sense to us in our mindset in the 21st century, but it did to them in what was the 18th century. The Southerners wanted to count enslaved peoples as citizens. However, the Northerners argued that enslaved people could not vote, and they considered them property, so in the South, so how could they be given the rights as a whole person? So the Northerners also suggested that if the slaves could be counted for representation, they should be counted for purposes of taxation as well. So what the Northerners were saying were like, well, if you think they're people, then we'll tax them like people. And then the Southerners backed down again, saying, wait a second, they're not people. You can't tax us that much. So to compromise, it was Three-Fifths Compromise was worked out. Every 5 enslaved persons in the state would count as 3/5 persons for determining both representation and taxes. Checks and balances, you will see a slide on in the future. Checks and balances systems presents any one branch of the 3 branches of government from becoming too powerful within this system. Each branch of government had the ability to limit the power of the other 2 branches. When you look at this next slide, you can see amending the Constitution was extremely important because at least the framers knew that times were going to change. Somehow, I'm sure they felt it in their own lifetimes, but imagine over hundreds of years how much things were going to change. And so they needed a way to change the document, and so it's a living, breathing document that isn't static from 1787, 1788, 1789. So that's what would happen. Then it had to be approved. That's where the great debate happened. Once the convention ended, the delegates rushed back to their home states to push the new Constitution for ratification. Ratification means making something valid by formally ratifying or confirming it. The debates took place in mass meetings and were in the columns of newspapers as well as everyday conversations. When it came to ratifying, two large groups were formed, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Just as a note, we are a republic, not a democracy, and you can see the definition of a republic there. So with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, we have this slide, and you can see a little bit of the differences. You can look at the column, or you can look at the pictures to the left while I read to the right. The Federalists were supporters of the Constitution. Many farmers that lived near the coast were supporters of the Constitution. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay were adamant supporters of the Constitution and published a series of writings that persuaded Americans that were called the Federalist Papers. The Anti-Federalists were opponents to the Constitution. The name Anti-Federalist was misleading because most of these men were not truly against federalism. Some prominent figures of the Anti-Federalists included John Hancock, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and George Clinton. The fight for ratification, and we're going to look at Massachusetts first. Originally, opponents of the Constitution held the upper hand. The group was led by Samuel Adams. This is just within the state of Massachusetts, and each state has to approve of the Constitution. So that's what these arguments are where they're happening. And his objections to the Constitution. Once the promise of the attached Bill of Rights was completed, Adams decided to vote for ratification. So he just wanted to make sure those rights were there, and then Massachusetts would vote for ratifying the Constitution. The final vote of 187 members voted for the Constitution proposed to its 168 that voted against it. Once Massachusetts ratified the Constitution, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire followed. So then we have our next slide. Now we look at New York and Virginia. New York was a tougher state to win over. 2/3 of the assembly were anti-federalists led by Governor George Clinton. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, managed to delay the final vote until New Hampshire and Virginia had both ratified the Constitution. The fact that those states ratified would have put New York in a situation where they would have to fend for themselves while being surrounded by states that ratified the Constitution. The final vote was 30-27, was extremely close, but the Federalists were able to prevail. By July of 1788, all states except Rhode Island and North Carolina had ratified the Constitution. In November 1789, the Bill of Rights was actually created. North Carolina ratified the Constitution, and May of 1790, Rhode Island ratified the Constitution. When all the smoke cleared, the new government was intact. George Washington was named the first president of the United States under this Constitution. In Virginia, George Washington and James Madison presented arguments for ratification to the Virginia Convention. Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, as well as other anti-federalists, made arguments against it. And remember, these are people that fought together during the American Revolution, and then they started to take sides on this issue. Very similar to Massachusetts, Virginia ratified the Constitution when the Bill of Rights was added. So what does the Constitution actually look like? Well, a breakdown is right here. We have the preamble, we the people, in order to form a perfect union. Then you have the amendments. There are the first 10 that were always there, followed by 17 that have been added. And then there's the articles. And so the articles are broken down as follows. Article 1 is about the legislative branch, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives, and we also call it Congress. very confusing when one body has so many names, but you know, each of us has many names. We could be sister or mother or daughter or, you know, just our names. Article 2, the executive branch. That's where our president is and vice president. Article 3, judicial branch. Article 4 deals with state citizenships, new states. Article 5, the amendment process. Article 6, debt supremacy and religious text. And Article 7, the ratification. When we look at the Bill of Rights, you can see the 10 Bill of Rights. These are made to protect the citizens and give you these rights. They are the first 10 out of 27 amendments. Some of the famous ones are, number 1, I always remembered it as RASP, R-A-S-P-P, Freedom of Religion, Assembly, Speech, Press, and Petition. Petition is to say this is wrong. I plead the Fifth. That is the Fifth Amendment. That's when you don't witness against yourself. A hot topic right now is Amendment 2, the right to bear arms, and how that particular right is interpreted seems to be something of a controversy in our lives right now. So you can see all of these first 10 amendments and how without those it would be very difficult to be a citizen in a country. And many countries in the world do not have anything like this. So you need to be very careful sometimes when you travel. Okay, then a breakdown of the articles. Here you can see them. The legislative branch, there are 10 sections, and they break down the powers of Congress and how people are elected, the terms of being elected, how long you're in office. The same thing goes for the executive branch, the judicial branch. And then you come down to state citizenship in Article 4. You see I have a driver's license there. That's because you're allowed to drive in California even if you hold a Nevada driver's license. Those are those types of things. If I'm married in one state, I'm married in all 50 states. Okay? The amendment process is, of course, the changing or adding an amendment to the Constitution. And then here we have one under Article 6. And you see I have the marijuana is legal in Colorado and Washington, which of course is true, but the federal courts are stronger and more powerful laws than the states. So technically, it can't be legalized in those states because technically the federal law, our government in Washington says, in D.C., Washington, says, no, you can't do that. But apparently recently a decision was made that their laws will not, federal laws in Colorado and Washington will not be enforced on the legalization of marijuana. And then the last section is the ratification. When you look at the checks and balances, you can see this is how one branch of government has the power to control another branch of government. So you can see if the legislative branch down to your right has a check on the executive branch, you can see all of the ways that they control the president and the vice president. And yet you can also see the ways that the executive branch gets to control the legislative branch. Articles 1, 2, and 3 get to tell you exactly how these people are put into office. So you have the executive branch, Article 2, the president. It includes the vice president as well. They are elected by the Electoral College. They serve 4 years with a maximum of 10. And they have to be 35 years old. They have to be born within the United States. They cannot become, they can't be born in another country and then take office. The legislative branch is the House and the Senate. Those two combined are also called Congress. The House has 435 members, the Congress 100. They are both elected. Notice the House only serves 2 years, but there are no maximum to how many years you serve. And then you have to be 25 years old, and you have to have been in the United States and been a naturalized citizen for at least 7 years. Finally, the judicial branch is Article 3, Supreme Court, 9 members. You're nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and you can be in for a lifetime or you can choose to resign. And there's really no stipulations to age or previous occupation, which is kind of strange because you just assume it's going to be a previous judge, but there's actually nothing that forces it to be that way. Right here, just a little thought, who was the first president? We have John Hanson and George Washington, And when you think of the President of the United States, many people do not realize that we are actually referring to presidents elected under the U.S. Constitution. Everybody knows that the first president in that sense was George Washington. But in fact, the Articles of Confederation, the predecessor to the Constitution, also called for a president, albeit one with greatly diminished power. 8 men were appointed to serve one-year terms as president under the Articles of Confederation. John Hanson became the first president of the United States in Congress assembled under the Articles of Confederation. So please take this interesting fact to your parents and remember that you learned it right here at Odyssey Charter School.